This is a small group. I'm going to give you the more unedited version of this talk, which is, the subtext is why I quit doing PET imaging research after 15 years of this. Okay. So I'll start with some PET methodology. This is an example of a raclopride scan. This is raclopride binding to the D2 receptors. Our outcome measure is simply binding potential, or BPND. Is a ratio of specific binding here to non-specific binding of the radiotracer to other random proteins in the brain. In most subjects, and most of the data I'll show you today, we get 2 data points. One is before, at the baseline condition, just imaging D2 receptors, and the outcome measure is BPND. And then the second outcome measure is after we give a stimulant challenge. We can give different stimulant challenges. In this case, it's IV amphetamine. This is 0.3 milligrams per kilogram, and you get a decrease in raclopride binding. The reason is because you get an increase of endogenous dopamine in the brain. That increase in endogenous dopamine in the brain makes fewer D2 receptors available to bind raclopride. The outcome measure here is delta BPND, which is simply the change in binding of raclopride to the D2 receptors in the baseline condition compared to the amphetamine condition. What's important to realize is that this gives us a measure of endogenous dopamine tone in the brain, or presynaptic dopamine release. So the percent decrease in radiotracer binding is correlated linearly to the percent increase of dopamine release in the brain. So the 2 outcome measures I'll be talking about today are BPND, which is D2 receptor binding, and delta BPND, which is a measure of dopamine release in the brain in response to a stimulant challenge. Now, going back in time, quite some distance back in time, we have known that addiction is associated with a decrease in D2 receptor binding. This is going back into the mid-1990s, at least with alcohol and cocaine dependence. In the beginning, it was thought to be related to cocaine dependence, but now we know that the decrease in D2 receptor binding spans all kinds of addictions, and it's very reproducible. So in cocaine addiction versus control, 7 out of 8 studies have shown a decrease in D2 receptor binding. Alcohol dependence, 8 of 10. Heroin, methamphetamine, tobacco, we see a consistent decrease in D2 receptor binding across these addictions. And in fact, if you're a PET imager and you look across your studies, you don't really see a difference between the different addictions. They're all decreased about 15 to 20%. The one outlier is cannabis dependence, where 5 out of 5 studies have now shown no change, no difference between the 2 groups in BPND, and we can talk about why that might be later. With respect to delta BPND, so this is the change in response to an amphetamine challenge or presynaptic dopamine release. Blunted or low delta BPND has been shown in a number of studies as well. Cocaine, alcohol, heroin, methamphetamine dependence, cigarette smoking. There's fewer studies, but they're equally consistent. In addiction, you have a decrease in D2 receptor binding, and you have a decrease in presynaptic dopamine release. Unlike D2 receptor binding, in cannabis dependence, we have 2 out of 3 studies showing blunted presynaptic dopamine release. One last methodology slides. Using animal models, we have parsed the striatum into the different subdivisions that we're interested in. In addiction, we're mostly talking about the ventral striatum or the limbic striatum, which gets input from the ventral tegmental area and is very involved in reward processing and habitual behavior, although so is the associative striatum, shown here in yellow, and even the motor striatum, shown here in blue. When I'm talking about these different regions, I'll be referring to the ventral striatum, the associative striatum, and the sensory motor striatum. Now, we know that there's a decrease in striatal dopamine signaling, but what is the relevance of this? What is the clinical significance of this? And there's really 3 different types of behavioral measures we can look at. The first is just measures of addiction severity. Then I'll be talking about drug-seeking behavior, and lately, treatment outcome, response to treatment. So starting with striatal dopamine and severity, a number of studies have shown that the decrease in D2 receptors and the decrease in dopamine signaling is associated with the greater severity of dependence. Andreas Heinz and his group has shown that there's a greater craving for alcohol associated with blunted signaling in the ventral striatum. There's also an increased response of the medial prefrontal cortex to alcohol-related cues. Methamphetamine dependence, this is mostly work done out of UCLA, showing that the decrease in D2 receptors correlates significantly and linearly with impulsivity and temporal discounting. And with respect to cocaine dependence, Neurovolkov has shown on a number of occasions that decreased D2 receptors correlates with lower, I won't say impaired, but lower glucose metabolism in the orbital frontal cortex, cingulate and medial prefrontal cortex, regions of the brain that mediate inhibitory control and salience. The next question is what is the connection between striatal dopamine and drug-seeking behavior? And specifically, we ask the question, does striatal dopamine signaling predict cocaine self-administration in the laboratory? So this is data going back a number of years ago, so I'll keep it brief. But basically, we took non-treatment seeking cocaine-dependent individuals, we admitted them into the hospital, we had a healthy control group, we did PET scans with raclopride, we got our usual outcome measures, BP&D and delta BP&D. After we did the PET scans, we put them in the laboratory and let them self-administer cocaine. So this is the results of the PET study. Again, same finding, cocaine dependence decrease in D2 receptor binding in the baseline condition, and also blunted. There's a blunted response to IV amphetamine. Essentially, there's really no change. So we give these individuals 0.3 milligrams per kilogram of IV amphetamine, which is a decent dose of amphetamine. It would make most of you hop out of your chairs and run around the room. And here we get very little response. We see no change between the baseline condition and the amphetamine condition, indicating that there's a significant loss of presynaptic dopamine release in the brain and cocaine dependence. So after the PET scans, we let people go into the laboratory and we let them self-administer cocaine. It's all smoked cocaine. Everyone who comes into the study has experience with smoked cocaine, so it's crack. We start the session. We give them a priming dose of cocaine, so they get 1 dose of cocaine for free. We test different doses of cocaine, placebo, 6 and 12 milligrams. And then after the priming dose, we let them choose between another dose of cocaine and $5. And so we're essentially, this is a measure of how much are you willing to alter your behavior in the presence of a competing reinforcer. The doses of cocaine that we give are low, 0, 6, and 12 milligrams. I can tell you that the ratings of these doses are pathetic and paltry. A decent dose of cocaine, if you were to be buying it on the street in New York City, would be between 25 and 50 milligrams of cocaine. $5 is worth more than the 6 milligram and the 12 milligram dose. $5, if you knew what you were doing, would buy you at least 20, 25 milligrams of cocaine. So the choices here are weighted towards the money. And because I do PET imaging research and not behavioral research, I need very simple outcome measures. Our outcome measure here is very simple. It's just how many times people choose cocaine over money when the money is worth more. And here's the results of that study. Even though people rated the 6 milligram dose, actually I didn't show you this data, but the 6 milligram dose was rated as being the same in terms of subjective effects as a 0 milligram dose. So the 6 milligram dose was rated as being as lousy as placebo, yet people took it more frequently. And they took the 12 milligram dose more frequently. And this is just an SPM map showing the correlation between striatal dopamine release or presynaptic dopamine release, raclopride displacement, and the choice for cocaine. And what we saw was that lower delta BP&D was associated with more choices for cocaine. In other words, when you take this data and look at the broader picture, some of the things we've been discussing now, when we have deficits of striatal dopamine transmission, what we see is a choice for a smaller, more immediate reward over the larger delayed reward, because as I mentioned, the money is worth more. People are towards the end of their stay, they're about to leave the hospital, they're about to earn more money, but they would have to wait until tomorrow or the next day to get that money, or they can take the cocaine now. The other thing that we think this represents is an inability to shift your behavior from choosing cocaine in the presence of an alternative reinforcer, even one of greater value. So in a sense, we were looking at a habitual behavior, one that we were unable to shift. And the more blunted or the more impaired someone's dopamine release is in the brain, the less likely they are to make that shift. Alternatively, cocaine-dependent subjects who still have some dopamine signaling in their brains, who still have some grease for the wheels, will shift their behavior. Those are the people who chose the money rather than the cocaine. So the next question is how does this relate to treatment response? And we asked the question, does dopamine release predict response to treatment in the clinical setting? So we did this previous study in the laboratory setting. Now I want to see, does this have relevance in the clinical setting? So it was a similar design. We ended up 24 cocaine abusers and 24 controls. We did the same thing. We scanned with raclopride before and after PO methylphenidate. We used PO methylphenidate instead of amphetamine because these are treatment seekers, and we didn't give treatment seekers IV amphetamine, although we've done worse to people, but still we did not give them IV amphetamine, we gave them oral methylphenidate. It has the same effect when you're talking about PET imaging. And our outcome measures were again, BP&D and delta BP&D, or baseline D2 receptor binding and presynaptic dopamine release. This time though, instead of giving people a choice between cocaine and money in the laboratory, we gave them the choice between cocaine and money in the clinic. They did 3 months of behavioral treatment. They did a treatment called, and as I mentioned, I do imaging, not behavioral treatment, but it's called contingency management with community reinforcement approach. It's a very standardized and tried and true treatment. Contingency management, which speaks to me, is giving people a choice between cocaine and money. They come into the clinic 3 days a week. Every time they test negative for cocaine, they earn money. It starts out pretty low. They start out earning like $1 or $2. If they're clean for the entire 3 months, they earn $997.50. It always bugged me that it wasn't just $1,000, but I didn't do that part of the study. What's interesting about this kind of treatment is it's actually very compelling, because while you have the hook of paying people to remain negative for cocaine, you actually use something called community reinforcement approach, which is simply encouraging people and giving people very concrete ways of shifting their behavior between competing rewards. So what you spend, the therapist spends time with people discussing, or patients discussing, is rather than spending your paycheck on a bunch of crack and alcohol on the weekend, you could spend your money on taking your children off somewhere, or your mother's birthday party, or paying rent, those kinds of things. This is the outcome of the behavioral treatment. As I mentioned, the outcome is simply voucher money. How much money did they earn over the 12 weeks? This is shown over here. We had people fall into two groups. It was a bimodal distribution, which has been described previously for this type of research, which actually is very helpful when you're analyzing small data sets, as we have with PET. So we have two groups. We have non-responders and treatment responders. 14 non-responders, 10 treatment responders. All the treatment responders were negative for cocaine at the 6-month visit, so even though they got 3 months of contingency management, they got a total of 6 months of treatment. So some people right off the bat responded. Some people took a while to get to that point, but at the 6-month mark, all of these people were negative for cocaine. And here's the results of that study. Over here we have the treatment responders and the treatment non-responders. So the treatment responders had higher D2 receptors compared to the treatment non-responders, and they had a greater response to methylphenidate. So looking at the bar graphs, this is looking at just the ventral striatum. This is the treatment responders and the non-responders. There's a decrease in D2 receptors, similar to the decrease in D2 receptors that we reported previously between controls and drug-addicted individuals. It's a small change, but it is significant. The big change is when we look at delta B PND, which is presynaptic dopamine release. These are the treatment responders, and these are the non-responders. The treatment responders displace about 13% of rapid pride binding. That's very similar to what we see in healthy controls. The non-responders are the ones who are displacing about 3% of rapid pride binding. That's similar to the previous studies I showed you, where the addicted individuals have low D2 or low rapid pride displacement. So what we're showing is that the people who respond to treatment are the people who essentially have normal presynaptic dopamine release in their brains, or compared to normal controls. These are the people who are able to respond to contingency management. They're able to respond to a scenario where they're given behavioral treatment that involves competing reinforcers. So we have the same finding as before. We have deficits in dopamine transmission are associated with the choice for the smaller, more immediate reward. And when we came out with that study, we were very interested to see that the Brookhaven group came out with a similar finding about the same year, this time in methamphetamine dependence rather than cocaine dependence, but they showed the same thing. This is just comparing methamphetamine abusers to controls. It's the same finding. Controls have higher D2 receptors and greater dopamine release compared to methamphetamine abusers. But what they also showed is that methamphetamine abusers who responded to treatment have higher BPND and delta BPND compared to those who relapse. So it's the same finding that we showed in cocaine dependence. Now, that data that I just showed you in about, I know I talk a little fast, in like maybe 10-15 minutes, took about 10 years. And we got to a point where we started shifting gears, because we asked the question, why do cocaine-addicted individuals have low dopamine release in their brains? If you look at post-mortem data, there's not a death of dopaminergic neurons. Cocaine doesn't kill off the dopamine neurons, but yet presynaptic dopamine release is pretty significantly blunted. So we started asking the question, is there some other neurotransmitter system that is tightly regulating the dopaminergic system that we can use for treatment development? And the answer to digging around was yes, and we think that is the kappa receptor system. The kappa receptor system has been described in rodent studies going back into the early 1990s. We know from all this data, which starts in 1988, that the more signaling you have at the kappa receptor, the less striatal dopamine release you have. So if you give kappa agonists, you decrease dopamine levels in the striatum, and you decrease dopaminergic neuron activity. You also decrease basal levels of dopamine, and you inhibit stimulant-induced dopamine release, which is exactly what we're seeing in the human brains with our PET imaging data. If you give less kappa signaling, you get more dopamine. So if you remove the kappa receptors, you get an increase in basal dopamine release, and kappa antagonists stimulate the release of dopamine in the striatum. So we were very interested in this system because not only does it sort of describe what we're seeing with the PET imaging data with dopamine, but it also gave data suggesting that if you can inhibit or block the system with antagonists, you may have a valid treatment in addiction, which would directly impact the dopaminergic system. We also know from post-mortem studies most of them done in the 1990s, that kappa receptors and dynorphin are upregulated in the brain in individuals who died from cocaine toxicity. So we also know from animal studies something very interesting about the kappa dynorphin system. We know that it seems to be very selective for stress-induced relapse. So if you stress an animal, you get dynorphin release. If you block those receptors, I'm going to skip down here. If you block those receptors, if you block the stress, if you stress an animal and block the kappa receptors with the kappa antagonist, you reduce the likelihood that that animal will relapse in the laboratory, which is essentially measured as cocaine or alcohol self-administration. So we are very interested in the fact that we see a difference between cocaine abusers and controls, at least with post-mortem data, with respect to the kappa dynorphin system, and it seems to be selective for stress. So with this in mind, we designed one of the most difficult and more miserable studies that I've ever done in my life. We started with a PET radiotracer for the kappa receptor, which took about 5 or 6 years to develop and was associated with significant misery, which I guess goes along with the kappa and dynorphin system. We developed this radiotracer in non-human primates. It worked beautifully. We got it to humans, and it was a nightmare. First thing you should know is the difference in the kappa receptors between rodent, non-human primate, and humans is significant. It's, unlike other receptor systems, it's very, very different. So while this radiotracer was very well behaved in non-human primates and rodents, it really sucked in humans. And one of the reasons for that is because humans have a much higher density of kappa receptors in the brain compared to animals, and it's a much higher affinity. So when we moved this radiotracer into humans, we discovered we had to scan for 3 hours as opposed to 90 minutes, which makes people quite miserable. There's no reference region. So I showed you previously our outcome measure was the specific binding to non-specific binding. We have no non-specific binding with this radiotracer because there are kappa receptors in every brain region. That wasn't the case with non-human primates. We had a reference region. What this means is that we have to have either an extra scan with naltrexone to measure non-specific binding where we block all the receptors. It also means that we have to have an arterial line, which is an invasive procedure in order to get our outcome measure. But lastly, because the kappa receptors are in such high density and such high affinity, we were limited by the dose. We could only give 0.2 micrograms per kilogram, which means you have to have a very talented chemist to synthesize this radiotracer. The first time we gave this radiotracer to a regular healthy individual, which we do, we made them quite psychotic and dysphoric, even though we gave them 9 micrograms of dose. So even though this was a nightmarish radiotracer, we still moved ahead with the study. We scanned 17 cocaine-dependent subjects and 15 healthy controls. I'll go over the rest of this later. This was the design of the study. We had the cocaine-dependent subjects admitted to the hospital. We have them monitored for abstinence. They're in the inpatient unit. We then do a scan with GR103545. That's our kappa agonist tracer. We then did a naltrexone scan so we could get non-specific binding. After that, we brought them into the laboratory and we did cocaine self-administration sessions. These are similar to the previous sessions, although in this case, instead of giving people a priming dose of cocaine, we gave them a stressor, and that was a cold pressor test. After that, we binged them on cocaine for 3 days, so we had them in the laboratory taking 600 milligrams a day of cocaine morning and evening, and we scanned them again. The idea here is that there's rodent studies showing that if you binge animals on cocaine, you get this massive increase in dynorphin in the brain. So we tried this in humans. We binged in cocaine for 3 days, and then we compared the baseline scan to the post-binge scan, the idea being that if we see a decrease in radiotracer binding, that is essentially endogenous dynorphin competing for the receptor. So I'll spare you all the more gruesome details of the study, but it was tough. And our first outcome measure is just comparing kappa receptor availability between cocaine-dependent individuals and healthy controls. And to make a long story short, we saw no difference between the two groups. This was unexpected. We expected cocaine abusers to have a higher kappa receptor binding compared to the controls because that's what we saw in the postmortem study, but we actually saw no difference. This number is now about 15 and 15. We could keep going, but the effect size is so small that we would have to scan 100 people if we wanted to see a difference. And then you have to ask yourself, is that clinically relevant? Because it would be a change of maybe 3-4%. So the end of the story is we did not see a difference in baseline kappa receptor binding between the two groups. As I mentioned, after that baseline scan, we then had people go into the laboratory. We started the session. Here we gave them a cold pressor test, which is an aversive stimulus, and we worked hard to make it as aversive as possible. What happens generally with a cold pressor test is that you have someone put their hand in warmish water and then they put it in really super cold water and then they take it out when they can't stand it anymore. We tried this on ourselves, and we realized that there are people like me who are quite wimpy with this kind of thing, and I took my hand out after about 10 seconds, and some people will last like, 3-4 minutes. So we decided to make this more standard across people, and we changed the cold pressor test so that people put their hand in warm water and then cold water. They kept it there for 120 seconds, then they took their arm out, they kept it there for 20 seconds, and then we repeated it for 120 seconds. So you couldn't wimp out and just take your arm out and say, I'm in pain, I don't want to do this anymore. We did warm water, cold water, warm water, cold water for a total of 4 minutes, so that everyone got the same aversive stimulus. After that, we did the same study as before. We gave people the choice between the same lousy dose of cocaine. This time we only used a 6 milligram dose because we had a lot of other things to do, and $5. And our outcome measure is just, again, how many times do they choose a dose of cocaine after an aversive stimulus. And this data we're still analyzing, but it's pretty much entering the final states of that. And in this case, we did see a correlation in the cocaine-dependent subjects. Cocaine-dependent subjects with higher values for VT, which is our outcome measure here. It's just kappa receptor availability. This is in the striatum overall, had more choices for cocaine. So to the extent that increased kappa receptor availability reflects increased kappa receptor signaling, what we see is that those subjects who have greater kappa receptors in the striatum are more likely to choose cocaine in the setting of an aversive stimuli. Then I mentioned after that we had people binge in the laboratory. We gave them just choices between cocaine and cocaine. There was no other choice. They could decline. It was pretty high doses. It was 600 milligrams total, 300 in the morning, 300 in the afternoon. They could decline doses, but they couldn't get anything for declining those doses. Subjects took at least 70% of the doses, which we expected. It's a lot of cocaine to expect everybody to take all of it. And we did the binge sessions on a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then went back to Yale. We did all the scanning at Yale for a PET scan on Thursday. And again, what we're trying to replicate is that whether binge dosing of cocaine increases dynorphin in the brain, as shown previously in rodent studies. And we did. We saw a significant decrease in kappa receptor binding after a 3-day binge of cocaine. The decrease is about 20%. We saw in all the striatal regions. This is ventral striatum, putamen, caudate, anterior and posterior, the striatum as a whole. The decrease is about 20%. But as I mentioned, kappa receptors are everywhere in the entire human brain. And we saw a decrease in kappa receptor binding globally. So the decrease is also in the cingulate, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, amygdala, DLPFC. We saw a decrease, again, around 15 to 20% across the brain globally after giving a binge dose of cocaine. So to summarize our results, we saw no difference in kappa receptor binding. We saw that cocaine-dependent subjects with higher kappa receptor availability are more likely to self-administer cocaine, and we saw that binge dosing of cocaine reduces kappa receptor binding in the brain, which is indicative of upregulating endogenous dynorphin and replicates the animal studies. Now, one issue with this is that we were working with the pharmaceutical industry, and I'll get to those slides next, trying to decide with them how to best develop a kappa antagonist as a treatment. And I think that with this data, what we've shown is a couple of things. First, we've shown translatability. We've taken the rodent data and the post-mortem data, and we've shown that it applies to the living human brain in cocaine-dependent individuals. What we've also shown is exactly what the rodent data shows, is that when you're talking about the kappa receptor and dynorphin, you're talking about stress-induced relapse. So in the future, when people do studies with kappa antagonists, this data combined with all the other data in rodents shows that if you're doing a clinical trial with kappa antagonists, just doing the regular straightforward phase 2, phase 3 trial, you're probably not going to see crap. It's probably going to be a negative study. You really have to talk about stress-induced relapse and people who relapse in the setting of stress. Those are the people who are more likely to respond to kappa antagonists, not every garden variety addicted individual that you can find on the street. And if you happen to be a CRO, now I'm going to start getting on my soapbox, you're a for-profit clinical trials organization, and you recruit anybody who comes in and do phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials, it's going to fail. But try and convince the pharma industry of this is like talking to a rat on the subway platform. Frankly, you don't get very far. So again, going back to why I quit doing PET imaging research and decided to do something else, is because I did this for 15 years. I think this data, combined with all the other imaging data from a lot of different groups, gives us a very clear indication of the treatments we need for addiction. That we can use this data to develop better medications for addiction, and yet we cannot do that nonetheless. starting with the dopamine system, can we increase signaling at the D2 receptors? We know from rodent studies that if you use a viral vector to increase D2 receptors in the striatum, you decrease cocaine and alcohol dependence. I don't think we're quite at the point where we're injecting viruses into the human brain. But nonetheless, what this does suggest is if you can increase signaling at the D2 receptor, you might be able to do something to treat addiction. So this brought to our attention the adenosine 2A receptors. The adenosine 2A receptors form heteromers with the D2 receptors. Antagonists at the A2A actually increase D2 receptor signaling. So we were very interested in this as a potential treatment because unlike dopaminergic agonists, which have not worked as a treatment for cocaine dependence or other types of addiction, what we think is an adenosine 2A antagonist, by increasing signaling at the D2 receptor, maintains the native firing at the dopaminergic system. We know that the dopamine system has a very specific role in the brain. Its role is to fire in response to environmental context. Simply giving a dopaminergic agonist does not replicate that. But something like an adenosine 2A antagonist, where you can increase the gain, you can increase the signal at the D2 receptor. Even if your presynaptic dopamine release is low, if you can increase the amplification of that signal, this may be a viable treatment. This is exactly the rationale that was used to develop adenosine 2A antagonists for Parkinson's disease. One is currently in use in Japan, KW602, which is a very nice compound. There's another one in phase 3 for Parkinson's disease in Europe. It's SYN115. The company is Biot. And then there's SCH4208414, which was developed by Merck in the United States for Parkinson's disease, which failed phase 3. It passed in phase 2 and failed in phase 3 for Parkinson's disease, which suggests to me that it's probably a great drug. That being said, we've spent 3 years trying to get these compounds into humans as a potential treatment for addiction and have not succeeded in that realm. Most lately, we submitted an IND for KW602 to the FDA, and we were laughed out of the FDA nicely, but still told to go away. Biot has no interest in developing any treatment for addiction. Merck also, I've been knocking on the Merck door for 3 years. They have had zero interest for 3 years in letting us use this medication for addiction despite the neuroscience data. Now, Palatinate has failed for every indication they could possibly think of, so they're considering addiction now, 3 years later. Kappa antagonists. I think kappa antagonists, as I said, would be very effective, particularly for stress-induced relapse. Getting this compound into human has been equally as much of a head banging against the wall. JD-TIC was an interesting compound. It was developed by NIDA. It's a kappa antagonist. It was discontinued due to cardiotoxicity. It causes ventral VTAC, ventricular tachycardia, which is not sustainable. Pfizer also developed a kappa antagonist. It was discontinued for toxicity concerns. They won't reveal exactly why, but it was probably cardiotoxic. And then the last one is LY2456302, which was developed by Eli Lilly. It was developed for depression. They did PET imaging studies at Yale. They've shown it has very good occupancy of the kappa receptors. They sold the license to Sirocor in February of last year. They won't exactly say why they lost interest in it for depression, but they have. Sirocor is interested in developing it for addiction. We've worked with them to an extent, but they will not make the compound available for academic research. What I have not included is a slide with mGluR5. We've also done imaging with mGluR5 receptors. This has been done in nicotine, alcohol, and cocaine dependence. We see alterations. I think an mGluR5 antagonist may be a promising way to go. mGluR5 antagonists have been developed for Fragile X syndrome and have failed. They failed both phase 2 and phase 3. But again, getting these compounds from the pharma industry to test addiction has been difficult. We have a little bit of progress. We may be testing one mGluR5 antagonist down the road, but nonetheless, it has been a difficult road to hoe. I will add, so that is why I quit doing PET imaging research. We've done this amazing data showing that these are the directions to go, and we can develop viable treatments for addiction, and yet we are unable to do so. We can discuss more as to why that is. I will stand here and tell you endlessly about how evil the pharma industry is, but I've had very long discussions with the pharma industry, and they came back with, they have some valid points actually. Their most valid point is, to keep it short, I might be past time, but their most valid point is essentially, even if they had the best medication on the face of the earth to treat addiction, it would be worthless to them. And it's not because they have a bias against addiction, it's because we can't implement it as clinicians. So if we go back to this data, This is the data from contingency management and community reinforcement approach. This does not require FDA approval. It only requires a competent therapist. This treatment is manualized. You can get the manual pretty much for free. This treatment works in 10 out of 14 people. This is replicating previous studies going back to the 1990s, showing that contingency management actually has a valid treatment response, a valid effect size as a potential treatment for addiction. It won't be everybody, but it might be 20–30% of people who show up for treatment. If you are a random individual in Atlanta or in Seattle or in Denver or in San Antonio, Texas, and you have an addiction problem and you want to receive community reinforcement with contingency management with community reinforcement approach, you cannot. This treatment is not implemented at any of the treatment centers that we have for addiction. If you enter a rehab, they do not use this treatment. They use 12-step treatments because basically it's cheap and easy. We have not implemented the treatments that we know work on a community-wide basis as a potential treatment for addiction. And it's true. That's the point of the pharma industry. It is not entirely the fault of the clinical community. Part of it has to do with insurance reimbursement. Part of it has to do with just sort of a lack of moving the field forward in terms of the way we treat addiction. But their point is, why should they invest in the treatment for addiction when it likely won't be implemented? Consider the case of naltrexone and alcohol dependence. I mean, the number to treat for naltrexone is not great. It's like, maybe 9 or 10. But 1 or 10 people will respond to naltrexone who have alcohol dependence. Yet the number of prescriptions given out on a yearly basis of naltrexone for alcohol dependence is paltry. It's almost none. So they do have, to an extent, a point. Like, they don't have a way of implementing these treatments in a clinical setting. So that is why I quit doing PET imaging research, because I felt like I reached a wall. And we can talk about other directions that we're moving into with brain stimulation. But with that, not to be a completely negative note, I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Thanks for the brilliant talk, but what is it that you're going to do?
We are doing some work using brain stimulation. We're using some TMS and some other, developing some novel brain stimulation techniques, mostly because the company that makes the hardware is willing to work with us and give us the equipment. It also ties back, that's not the only reason, it ties back to the connection between D2 receptors and the prefrontal cortex. So we're trying to see if we can do some brain stimulation of the prefrontal cortex. Can we change what's happening in the striatum? That's some of it.
Also, you spoke also about the adenosine 2 receptor, and that comes into an association maybe with sleep. Have you ever looked at sleep patterns in your data sets? Because sleep deprivation decreases dopamine 2 receptors, which may actually be contributing in finding.
We really haven't, and we should go back and look at that data. We have a little bit of a problem because in all of our studies we bring people into the hospital because we want to make sure that they're maintained clean, and they all sleep horribly for the first couple of days, but then we kind of get everything washed out of their systems and they kind of sleep pretty well. But the whole point is just we don't have a whole lot of variability because we kind of give everybody this one artificial environment. But we could go back and look at it. Yeah.
I just want to comment on the treatments for addiction. Buprenorphine has been successful. I mean, it took 3 decades.
I know, right? That's exactly the point. Buprenorphine took 3 decades. Buprenorphine was first developed in the late 60s. And we're finally at a point where we're implementing it. And even still, getting buprenorphine as a treatment for opiate dependence is not so easy, despite the fact that people are dropping dead from heroin overdose, like left and right.
So the name of the drug again?
Buprenorphine?
Buprenorphine.
Yeah.
And that's not being given because...
It is. You can get it, but if you don't have the money to pay for it, to put it bluntly, it's difficult. It's expensive, and insurance coverage is a big issue. So yeah, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add to John Carr's point that actually there's a real move among the insurance companies and among the carriers to push for medications, cover medications treatments, right? Naltrexone is getting reimbursed pretty well now. I think the bigger story there, and Vivitrol particularly, the patch version or the supplement, the skin version of naltrexone. But the big issue is training and people feeling comfortable. I mean, people are using it quite, quite not as much as you would want.
Agreed.
uptake is, and
Well,
what
these,
does
I
the
mean,
recovery
I don't
look
want to completely get on my soapbox here, but I have had some very interesting discussions with the pharma industry, and one of the things that they have pointed out is that the way that they market and implement drugs is through centers of excellence, which I mean, I know that Columbia's got their little posters up saying Center of Excellence all over the place, but I never thought it meant much. But they have these centers of excellence, so if they're trying to implement a new drug for blood pressure, they go to the centers of excellence and they have those physicians implement the new treatment, and then they do talks and dinners or whatever, and they spread the news. We have 0 centers of excellence in the United States for addiction, none.
Well, why doesn't NIDA's CTN network take on that? I think it's a more complex issue.
It is, because what a center of excellence means is that you have a way, you have a nexus for changing prescribing behavior. And we just don't have that implemented for addiction at this point.
To John Troy's point, lots of them are $1 billion drugs.
Right.
And where it has gotten that money, or pharma sees it as a success story from their perspective, it's not an addiction campaign.
Right.
They've gone to pain centers of excellence. And
Exactly.
really put
And
it out there.
implemented it.
Obviously, there's a great overlap with opiate addiction, and so of course it's out there for opiates too. But
Right.
I mean, the story gets complicated more quickly, and we've got some issues in our own health services network.
Absolutely. And to an extent, I think you can argue it eventually comes down to the fact that none of this was reimbursed for forever. Right. So of course there's no center of excellence. There's no network for implementing novel changes in the clinical setting for addiction. Well, yet. So yeah. Sorry.
How about other technology, you think of nanotech, bypass pharma? For example, I mean, even with these drugs, you know, they're giving systemically. Can we brainstorm? And I've been talking to people who do physicists who do nanotech. Can you imagine a situation where you've already identified specific receptors that we can actually get more localized and create little tools that, you know, block or enhance these receptors in a focused manner via nanotech? And that's building rapidly. It's not being used in clinical application, but the actual tools already exist. Lawrence Livermore has these amazing tools. They're not thinking at all about applications.
Right.
Clinical applications.
So yeah, as a result of quitting PET, I've been trying to do more of that and going to more, you know, sort of technology-minded meetings and seeing what the applicability could possibly be to addiction. And that's why we're working on brain stimulation. We're doing some stuff with transcranial magnetic stimulation. We're also doing some stuff with developing embedded electrodes in the brain, and then we're also just essentially finding new ways to try and treat addiction that would circumvent the current status of going to pharma and waiting 10 years for phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials.
Thank you very much.